She left a note in the library book. The reader's reply changed everything. She didn't mean for anyone to find it. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe if you love meaningful stories, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I really enjoy seeing where these stories travel. The book was due back at the library, and she wasn't in the mood to keep it longer than she needed to. It had been a quiet afternoon, one of those gray days where everything felt a little heavier, even though nothing particularly bad had happened. She slipped the book into her bag and walked the few blocks to the library without saying much to anyone. She hadn't spoken much at all lately. It wasn't a book that stood out, just something she had pulled from the shelf a couple of weeks earlier because she liked the cover. She couldn't even remember what it was about now. Something fiction. Something distant from her own life. That was the point. Something that didn't require her to feel anything real. As she sat down in the return area to slide the book into the bin, her fingers hesitated. The book was already half open. She looked around. The library was quiet. A couple of older patrons sat at the computers. A woman in the children's section read aloud with a calm, practiced voice. The sound of the pages flipping felt louder than it should have. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It wasn't planned. The note had been sitting there for a while. Weeks, maybe. She had written it one night when she couldn't sleep. It wasn't a letter to anyone, just a few lines that had come out before she thought too hard about them. If you're reading this, I hope today feels a little less lonely. It's been hard lately. That was it. No name, no signature, no clever ending. She looked at it one more time, then slipped it between the final pages of the book. It stayed there like it belonged. No one saw. No one asked. She closed the cover and placed the book in the bin. On the walk home, she didn't think much about it. She didn't expect anyone to find it. Most people rushed through books or read digital versions now. And even if someone did find it, they'd probably just throw it away. Maybe they'd be confused. Maybe they'd think it was a mistake. Either way, she figured it would be gone before it ever meant anything. But there was something about putting that note in the book that stayed with her longer than she expected. It wasn't bold. It wasn't brave. But it felt honest. Like a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. That night, she lay awake again. The same ceiling. The same quiet. She tried to picture the book on someone else's nightstand. The pages open, the note falling out. She wondered who they might be, if they would pause long enough to read it, if maybe, just maybe, it would land in the hands of someone who needed it. She knew better than to get her hopes up. Things like that didn't happen, not in real life, not to people like her, but still, the image stuck with her. The next morning came and went like any other. She made coffee. She went to work. She smiled when she was supposed to, nodded in the right places. She moved through her day without anyone noticing anything different. But inside, the smallest part of her kept wondering, not hoping, just wondering. That night, before she went to bed, she sat on the edge of the mattress for a long time. She didn't reach for her phone. She didn't put on a show. She just sat there. It wasn't sadness exactly, more like the weight of everything unspoken. She had friends, people who cared. But there were still moments like this, quiet moments that made her feel like she was on the edge of something she couldn't name. The note hadn't changed anything. Not really. But it had felt like a release. Like maybe, if someone did find it, the loneliness she carried might feel a little lighter, if only for a second. She lay back and pulled the blanket over her shoulders. The light from the hallway crept in through the doorway. She closed her eyes and let it be quiet. She didn't think about the note again. Not for a while. He didn't expect to find anything when he opened the book. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The library was quiet, like it always was during the middle of the week. He wasn't looking for anything special. He just wanted something to read, something to take up space in the evenings when the silence in his apartment felt too loud. The book was sitting on the display near the front. Not a bestseller, not a staff pick, just something that caught his eye. The cover was worn, the pages a little bent, the way they get after a few people have passed them around. It didn't bother him. In fact, he liked books that looked lived in. It meant someone had held them, maybe even liked them. He took it home, tossed it on the kitchen counter, and didn't pick it up again until later that night. Dinner was quiet. Just him and the sound of the refrigerator humming. After the dishes were in the sink, he grabbed the book and sat down on the old couch by the window. He didn't turn on the TV. He didn't want any noise. A few pages in, something slipped out from the back. It fluttered to the floor without a sound. At first he thought it was just a receipt or a bookmark. He reached down, picked it up, and turned it over. It was a small piece of paper, folded once down the middle. The handwriting was careful, like someone had taken their time. He read the words slowly. "If you're reading this, I hope today feels a little less lonely. It's been hard lately." That was it. No name, no explanation, no reason for it to be there. He stared at the note longer than he probably should have. It didn't seem like much, just a sentence and a half, but something about it felt heavy, personal, like it wasn't meant to be read, and yet somehow it was. He looked around the room as if someone might be watching. Of course, no one was. He was alone, like always. He read it again. There was something familiar in it. Not the handwriting, not the wording, but the feeling. The sense of someone putting a little piece of themselves into the world and hoping it might land in the right hands. He leaned back on the couch and held the note loosely in his hand. He didn't know who wrote it, and he figured he probably never would. But he couldn't stop thinking about the fact that someone had. That someone out there felt the way he did. He folded the note and slid it back between the pages. Over the next few days, he read through the book slowly, not because the story was particularly gripping, but because the note stayed with him. He kept thinking about the person who had written it, what they had been going through, whether they ever got a reply. By the time he finished the last chapter, he knew what he wanted to do. It wasn't a big decision. It didn't feel dramatic. It just felt right. He found a clean piece of paper and a pen from the drawer in the kitchen. He sat down at the table, thought for a moment, and then started to write. "I don't know who you are, but your note found me at the right time. You're not the only one struggling. If you want to leave another note, I'll be checking this book again in a few weeks." He paused, read it back to himself, and nodded once. That was enough. No name, no pressure, just a reply. He tucked it gently into the back of the book, close to where he had found hers. Then he walked back to the library and placed the book in the return bin. No one saw him. No one asked him what he was doing. He didn't tell anyone. But as he walked back to his apartment, hands in his pockets, the air a little colder than before, he realized he felt just a little less alone. She hadn't planned on checking out the same book again. It had been a few weeks, maybe longer. Time had a way of blending together lately. She wasn't sure why she picked it up that day. Maybe it was habit. Maybe she just wanted something familiar. Or maybe, deep down, she was hoping the note was still there. When she pulled the book from the shelf, she didn't open it right away. She carried it home, set it down on the table, and walked past it more than once before finally sitting down to read. It wasn't until she was about halfway through that she remembered. She turned to the last few pages and held her breath without meaning to. She flipped through slowly, not sure what she expected. Maybe nothing. But then, there it was. A different piece of paper. She froze. Her hands felt unsteady as she pulled it out and unfolded it. It was a short message, neatly written. I don't know who you are, but your note found me at the right time. You're not the only one struggling. If you want to leave another note, I'll be checking this book again in a few weeks. She read it twice, then a third time, slower. It took her a moment to process that someone had seen what she wrote. Not just seen it, but felt something from it. The note hadn't been a cry for help. She hadn't expected anyone to find it, let alone understand it. But now, here was proof. Someone out there felt the same way she did. She set the paper on the table beside her and stared at it for a long time. It didn't feel like a coincidence. She picked it up again and held it between her fingers. It wasn't a long message. Nothing dramatic or overdone. Just honest. Just real. And that's what made it matter. Later that night, she sat at the kitchen table with a pen in her hand. She wasn't sure what to write. It felt strange, trying to respond to someone she didn't know. But somehow, it also felt easier than talking to the people she did. She started with a thank you. Thank you for writing back. I didn't think anyone would. I don't know what made me leave that first note. I guess I just needed to feel like someone was out there. She paused, thought about crossing it out, but left it. It's been hard lately. Not for any big reason. Just a lot of little ones that seem to pile up. Some days feel heavier than others. I try not to let it show. She sat there, pen still in hand, tapping lightly on the edge of the paper. Then she added one more line. It helped knowing someone understood. I'll leave this note here. Maybe we'll keep writing. No name. No identifying details. Just a quiet message to someone who had become more real than most of the people in her life. She folded the paper and placed it carefully inside the back cover of the book, where the first note had been. Then she closed the book and stared at it for a long while. It was strange how something so small, just a piece of paper, a few words, could change the way the world felt. She brought the book back to the library the next day. She didn't linger. She didn't look around to see if anyone noticed. But as she walked out the front doors and into the cold morning air, there was a weight that had lifted, just a little. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know if he was young or old, nearby or far away. But she knew he existed. And for the first time in a while, that was enough. He hadn't been sure she'd write back. The library felt the same as always. Quiet. Familiar. A few people scattered at the tables, a librarian shelving books near the back. He didn't ask if the book was available, just walked to the shelf where he'd found it before and hoped it was there. It was. He pulled it down slowly, careful not to let his hopes get ahead of him. He knew it was possible the note had been removed, that maybe someone else had checked it out and tossed the paper without thinking twice. He told himself not to expect anything, but he still turned the pages with care. The note was there, tucked neatly near the back, folded once, just like his had been. His hands were steady, but his heart picked up speed. He unfolded the paper and read the first line. Thank you for writing back. He exhaled, quiet and slow. I didn't think anyone would. He read the rest without moving, his thumb pressing lightly against the edge of the page. The note wasn't long, but it said more than a longer letter might have. She talked about how things had felt lately, not with dramatic words or details, just truth. The kind of truth that didn't ask for attention. The kind that sat quietly in the background of everyday life. Some days feel heavier than others. I try not to let it show. That line stuck with him. It sounded like something he could have written himself. He sat down at one of the nearby tables with the book open in front of him and the note resting beside it. He read it again, slower this time. Not just the words, but the space between them, the pauses, the silence she hadn't filled. It wasn't about fixing anything. It wasn't even about advice. It was just connection. And it felt like something he didn't know he needed. He reached into his coat pocket for a pen. There was a scrap of paper tucked in his notebook. He tore it out gently and set it on the table. He looked at the note she'd written, then back at the blank page in front of him. He wasn't sure where to start, but he didn't overthink it. He just began. "I'm glad you left the first note. It's strange how much it helped, just knowing someone else was feeling the same way." He paused, thought about stopping there, but he kept going. "Everything feels kind of heavy lately, too. I think a lot of people are carrying things they never talk about. I know I am. Most of the time, I just keep my head down and try to get through the day. But reading your note made it feel like maybe it's okay to say that out loud." He didn't try to make it sound better than it was. He didn't try to turn it into something neat or hopeful. He just told the truth. "I don't really talk to anyone about this stuff, but writing to you feels different. I think I'd like to keep writing, if you're okay with that." He signed nothing. No name, no hint of who or where he was. Just folded the paper, tucked it into the back of the book, and placed the original note beside it. He wanted her to know he'd read it, that it mattered. Before he returned the book to the front desk, he sat with it for a moment longer. Not because he wasn't ready to let it go, but because he was. Something had shifted. Not everything. Not the loneliness or the weight of the days. But enough. Enough to feel a little more steady. A little more seen. He handed the book to the librarian without saying anything, gave a small nod, and walked back outside. The air felt colder than he remembered, but it didn't bother him. He didn't know her name, didn't know what she looked like or where she lived, but he knew her words, and that was enough to keep going. She didn't go to the library right away. After her last note, she tried to let it go, tried to tell herself it didn't matter whether he replied or not. She'd said what she needed to say. That should have been enough. But something about the waiting started to grow. Quiet at first. Just a passing thought when she walked past the library, or when she saw the book's title on someone's reading list online. Then, little by little, it became harder to ignore. She waited 3 weeks, then 4. By the 5th, she gave in. She told herself she was just curious, that she wasn't expecting anything. But as soon as she stepped into the library, she knew that wasn't true. The building was warm, familiar. The same man was at the front desk. The same creaky floorboard near the fiction aisle. She made her way to the shelf slowly, afraid the book wouldn't be there. But it was. She pulled it out with careful hands and carried it to a corner chair near the back wall. Her fingers brushed the cover before opening it. She flipped through the last few pages, heart ticking faster with every turn. And there it was, a new note, folded clean, tucked just behind hers. Her breath caught in her throat. She unfolded it and began to read. "I'm glad you left the first note. It's strange how much it helped, just knowing someone else was feeling the same way." She kept reading, eyes scanning slowly, taking in each word as if it might slip away if she moved too fast. "Everything feels kind of heavy lately, too. Most of the time, I just keep my head down and try to get through the day." Her hand trembled slightly as she reached the end. "Writing to you feels different. I think I'd like to keep writing, if you're okay with that." She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. There was something steadying in the way he wrote. No rush, no pressure. Just a quiet invitation to keep going. She placed the note on her lap and sat still for a long time. It wasn't just about loneliness anymore. It was about the connection, not with a face or a name, but with the space they'd made between 2 pages of an old library book. A space where they both felt like they didn't have to pretend. She reached into her bag, pulled out her notebook, and tore out a clean page. She started to write without thinking too much. I'm still here. I didn't think anyone would write back again. I guess I didn't want to hope for that. But I'm glad you did. She paused, pen hovering above the page. Some days are still hard. But these notes, it's helped more than I know how to say. She hesitated for a moment, then added another line. I used to think no one noticed people like me. I didn't mean that in a dramatic way. Just that some of us pass through life quietly. It feels like you understand that. She looked at what she'd written. It wasn't perfect. It didn't have to be. She folded the note carefully and slid it behind his, keeping them together. Then she closed the book and walked it to the front desk. The man behind the counter gave her a polite smile. She returned it without speaking and stepped outside into the late afternoon air. There was a chill, but it didn't feel sharp, just something to notice as she pulled her jacket tighter. She didn't know who he was. She didn't need to. But knowing he'd come back, that he'd chosen to keep the conversation going, that meant more than she could put into words. She walked home slowly, the corners of her mouth lifting just a little. Not a smile exactly, just something close, something real. And for the first time in a long while, the day didn't feel quite so heavy. The notes didn't stop. They kept writing, even as the weeks turned into months. Not every day. Not on a schedule. Just whenever one of them felt like they had something to say. It became a kind of rhythm, quiet, simple, and steady. The book stayed on the shelf long enough for one of them to find it, write their note, and return it again. Over and over, without fail. No names, no rules, just words shared between two people who still didn't know each other, but somehow understood each other better than most. The first time he saw her handwriting again, something in him eased. She had written about a morning that started with tears and ended with tea, and how she couldn't explain the shift, but was grateful for it. He read it 3 times before writing back. He told her about his uncle's passing, how he hadn't cried at the funeral, but had broken down 3 days later while folding laundry. He hadn't told anyone else that, not even family. But he wrote it in the note like it belonged there. She responded a week later. I don't think grief waits for the right time, she wrote. It shows up in the middle of ordinary things, and somehow that's when it hits hardest. They didn't just write about sadness. There were lighter moments, too. He once wrote about how his coffee machine had flooded the entire counter and ruined his breakfast. She replied that she once burned toast so badly her fire alarm wouldn't stop beeping for 10 minutes. It made him laugh. Really laugh. The kind that stays with you for the rest of the day. The notes became a place where they could be exactly who they were, without apology, without needing to explain the silence between replies, without the pressure to always be okay. Sometimes they wrote about books, ones they'd read, ones they didn't finish, ones that reminded them of something they couldn't name. She told him about a children's book she used to read when she couldn't sleep. He said he still had a copy of one his mom used to read to him when he was sick. It was the small things that connected them. Neither of them tried to guess who the other was. Not out loud. Maybe they each had a picture in their mind. But it didn't matter. The notes weren't about faces or facts. They were about honesty. About presence. About showing up on paper when it felt too hard to show up anywhere else. One afternoon, she mentioned how she always sat in the same spot by the window when she wrote. She said the light there felt softer and for some reason, that helped. He wrote back that he usually wrote from his kitchen table, but lately he'd started taking the book to a nearby park. There was a bench no one seemed to notice. He said it was quiet there, and sometimes he stayed long after he finished writing. She told him she liked imagining that. Him on the bench, writing carefully, with the book resting on his knee. He said he liked imagining her by the window, the light falling across her notebook, her handwriting careful and kind. It wasn't a love story, at least not in the usual way. It was quieter than that. It was two people slowly finding their way out of the kind of loneliness that doesn't always have a reason, the kind you don't talk about at parties or explain in conversation. It was a connection that didn't demand anything. It didn't ask them to be more than they were. It just let them be. And somehow, that was enough to keep going. It was her idea to ask. She didn't plan it, didn't sit down with the intention of changing anything. But something in her hand hesitated when she reached for the paper that day, and before she even finished the sentence, the question had already made its way onto the page. "Have you ever thought about meeting?" She stared at the words for a long time. It wasn't pressure. It wasn't even really a suggestion. It was just a question. Quiet, careful, honest. She almost scratched it out, but she didn't. Instead, she folded the note like always, tucked it behind the others, and returned the book to the library the next morning. She spent the next week wondering if she'd made a mistake. It wasn't that she was scared, at least not in the obvious way. It was more that she didn't want to lose what they had. The notes had become steady in her life. They were something she could count on. She worried that meeting in person might change that, make it harder, make it something different. Still, the question had come out naturally, not from a place of need, but from curiosity. She had started to wonder who this person was, the one who wrote so openly, who understood silence and sadness the way she did, the one who showed up for her through pieces of paper and ink. She just wanted to know. When he found her note, it took him a long time to write back. He sat in the park with the book open beside him and the folded paper in his hand. He read the question once, then again, and again. "Have you ever thought about meeting?" He hadn't, until now. He looked around the park, the way the light hit the grass, the distant sound of kids playing by the swings, the bench beneath him that had become more familiar than his own couch. And for the first time, he imagined someone sitting beside him. He thought about her window, the soft light, her handwriting, the way she always knew how to say something true without making it feel heavy. He didn't feel nervous. He just felt unsure. Not of her, not of the connection, but of what it would mean to take something that lived safely between pages and bring it out into the open. He gave himself a few days before writing anything, not because he didn't want to respond, but because he wanted to be honest. And sometimes honesty takes time. When he finally sat down to write, he didn't overthink it. He just let the words come. "I hadn't thought about meeting, not because I didn't want to, just because I didn't think it was something we needed. But I keep thinking about your question, and I think maybe we could." He paused. "I don't want to ruin this. These notes have meant more to me than I know how to explain. But I also think it might be okay to see the person behind the words. If you still want to." He suggested a time, a place, the bench in the park. Nothing complicated, nothing dramatic. Just two people sitting down. He folded the note, slid it behind hers, and returned the book to the library. And then he waited. He didn't know what she'd decide, and he told himself that whatever happened, the notes had already done their part. They'd been there when he needed them, when she needed them. That was enough. But still, part of him hoped. Not for something big, not for something perfect, just for her to say yes. She said yes. Her reply came just a few days later. It was shorter than usual, just a few lines written neatly on the same kind of paper she always used. I'll be there. She didn't give details. She didn't ask questions. She didn't overthink it. She just said yes. The bench he had written about sat near the edge of the park, close to a small walking path lined with trees. It wasn't hidden, but most people passed it by without looking. He liked that about it. It was quiet, but not too far from the world. He got there early. He wasn't sure why. Maybe part of him thought she wouldn't show, and he wanted time to sit with that before he had to leave. Or maybe he just wanted to be there first, so she wouldn't have to walk up alone. He sat down and rested the book on his lap. The same book. The same one they'd passed back and forth for months. The air was cool, the kind that hinted at fall, even though summer hadn't quite let go. People passed by now and then. A couple walked their dog. A man jogged past in headphones. But he didn't notice much of it. He was watching the path, listening for footsteps. He told himself he'd give it an hour. No more. If she didn't come, that would be okay. He'd understand. Things like this didn't always go the way you wanted, and even if she didn't show, it wouldn't erase what they had shared. But then she turned the corner. She was wearing a light jacket, hair pulled back. Nothing about her was dramatic or bold. She looked like someone you might pass on the street without noticing. But the moment he saw her, he knew. She saw him too. There was a second, just one, where they both paused. Then she walked over and sat down beside him. They didn't say anything at first. They didn't need to. The silence between them didn't feel awkward. It felt familiar. The kind of quiet that had always been there, even in the notes. It had never been about filling space. It had been about showing up. He turned to her and smiled, just a little. "Hi." She smiled back. "Hi." It was enough. They sat for a while, neither of them rushing to speak. The book was still on his lap. He opened it, flipped to the back, and held up the most recent note. "I wasn't sure if you'd come," he said. "I wasn't either," she replied, "but I wanted to." He nodded, looked out at the trees for a moment. "This bench feels different now." She glanced around, then back at him. "I pictured it a lot. When you wrote about it, it's like I've been here before." He smiled. "Me too." There was a comfort in it, in the way they didn't have to explain themselves, in the way they both knew what it had taken to get here, not just to the park, but through the months of showing up on paper, even when everything else felt too heavy. They talked, eventually, not all at once, not about everything, just enough. He asked about the window she always sat by. She asked about the park bench and how often he came here. They laughed about the toast and the coffee machine. They filled in the small details that the notes had left out. But they didn't rush anything. When it started to get colder, she stood and pulled her jacket tighter. "I should head back," she said. He nodded. "Yeah." There was a pause. She looked at him, not with hesitation, but with something softer, something steady. "Can we keep writing?" she asked. He didn't even have to think about it. "Yeah," he said. "I'd like that." They didn't hug. They didn't exchange phone numbers. They didn't make promises. But as she walked away, he stayed on the bench a little longer. The book still in his hands. The pages still carrying every word they'd shared. And for the first time, the story didn't feel unfinished. It just felt like it had turned a page. They still write. Not in library books anymore. That part of their story had ended the way it needed to. quietly, naturally, without ceremony. Now, the notes live in a small notebook they pass between them. It's nothing fancy, just a soft cover, lined pages, and a little wear around the edges from being opened and closed so many times. He had picked it up from a local shop, left it at the bench with a note inside. Thought we might try something new. She found it the next day. That notebook became theirs, a place where the pages belonged to both of them. They didn't always write full letters. Sometimes it was just a few sentences, a thought from the day, a memory that surfaced out of nowhere, a song lyric, a question, a line that didn't need context to matter. They didn't overthink it. He'd leave the notebook on the bench, tucked beneath the corner where the wood had split a little. She'd pick it up when she could, usually later that same day, then bring it back a few days later with her reply. It became a rhythm again. Not planned, not forced, just something that felt steady. In one entry, she wrote about the first time she found his note. How strange it had felt to be seen by a stranger. How even now she sometimes read that original reply when the days felt too long. He responded by telling her he still carried her first note in his wallet. Folded, worn, but never thrown away. "You reminded me I wasn't invisible," he wrote. "I didn't know how much I needed that." She told him she kept the book they used to share, the library one. After the last time, she checked it out one final time, returned it late on purpose, and offered to pay the small fee so she could keep it. "They let me," she wrote. "It felt like something worth holding on to." There were pages in the notebook that stayed mostly blank. Sometimes one of them didn't have much to say, but they still wrote something, even if it was just, "Today was hard, but I'm still here." The point was never to say something profound. The point was to show up, to keep showing up. One afternoon, months after that first meeting, they sat together on the bench again. No plan, no special reason. She had just written in the notebook and waited. He came by not long after. They didn't talk much, just sat, the notebook resting between them on the bench. After a while, he looked at her and said, "Do you ever think about how different this could have gone if one of us hadn't replied?" She nodded slowly. "I do," she said, "but I think about something else more." "What's that?" "That it didn't have to be loud or complicated to matter." He didn't say anything for a second, but he understood exactly what she meant. Most people wouldn't know their story. It wasn't the kind people told at dinner parties. There was no grand moment, no sudden spark. Just two people who had decided, without saying it, that their quiet connection mattered, that it was enough. They sat for a while longer, the afternoon light fading behind the trees. Eventually, she stood up, gave a small wave, and started walking home. He picked up the notebook and opened to the last page she'd written on. There was a new note, just 3 words this time. "Thank you, stranger." He smiled, closed the cover, and tucked the notebook under his arm. It wasn't about being strangers anymore. Not really. But maybe the word still meant something. Maybe it reminded them how all of this started, with a folded note left behind, with a simple message meant for no one, and somehow meant for exactly the right person. They didn't need anything more than that. And every time the notebook came back, they were reminded, this mattered. Still does, always will. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy meaningful stories like this, we'd love to have you as a subscriber.